Okay, so we're going to talk about law and ethics for pharmacy. It's going to take us a couple of days. I've added a couple of slides. If you look, this is kind of old. So I've added some slides in with this with some more current information because a couple of things have changed since then. So, what we want to talk about is the practice of pharmacy and how it's governed by law, regulation, rules, and how the federal, state, and local governments introduce those, what institutions introduce those, and how it pertains to the pharmacy technician. And what is important for you to know for your certification exam, as well as for employment. It's really important that you understand these laws and how they pertain to you as a medical pharmacy technician, pharmacy tech. Also, you're going to need to know these laws for your certification exam. They absolutely ask questions related to law and ethics. So one of the first laws was back in 1906, the first federal Food and Drug Act. Prior to that, labels could be misleading or inaccurate, or there could be things in the medication or the treatment. Many of you have seen lots of westerns and talk about snake oils. Well, they literally could put things in there and not tell you about it. They didn't have to be truthful. They didn't have to tell you that laudanum had opiates in it. It was just laudanum, and that was what was on the front. So, the Federal Food and Drug Act of 1906, they had to prove the effect. People had to prove the effectiveness of their meds, of their drugs, or what they were selling. They could not just say, "Here, take this liquid, and it will cure." Cancer, or they will take this liquid and it will cure all that ails you. They literally had to do studies and start to do studies and prove um, what caused what the cause and effect of that medication was. So, what did the 1906 Federal Food and Drug Act? One important things to remember that you had to have accurate labels and you had to prove your medicine did what you said it was going to do. In 1938, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, it actually was as part of the Food and Drug Act of 1906. It was more strict. It started to include cosmetics. It required drug companies to include directions on exactly how to take it. It required narcotics to have a warning to let you know it may be habit forming. So, as far back as 1938, we knew narcotics, opiates, controlled Schedule 1 and 2 controlled substances, even though they weren't schedules back then. We knew that things could be addictive. And so some of those things were actually sold over the counter. Some of those narcotics at the time were sold over the counter. And so the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act started making them talk about the purity of cosmetics, and they had to list what was in them and what the effects of them might be. Also, you had to define the exact labeling of the product, so it defined what misbranding was and how you could not say something did something. It really made it illegal. Before, you just had to prove something did what it said it was going to do. Now it made it illegal for you to not list things or not have things branded inappropriately. So saying that if you took a Tylenol, it would cure a broken bone. So it became illegal to have false advertisement, basically. Also, it made the FDA. So the 1938 Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act also enacted or made the Food and Drug Administration. It created it and made it a legal part of government. Started to give them some authority and power to oversee all of these new laws and rules. In 1951, the Durham-Humphrey Amendment required cautions, um, made cautions a federal law, and it prohibited dispensing certain things without a prescription. So you couldn't just sell some medications over the counter. It definitely defined and made a drew clear lines between prescription drugs and what could be sold over the counter. So it would say sold by prescription only. It made drug companies actually put that on their product, sold by prescription only, or can be sold over the counter. So that was an important thing, because not always did people know when they got things from certain places, maybe legally, not so legally, that it should have been received by a prescription. So it separated prescription and non-prescription drugs. It made there be a warning on things that say it must be sold by prescription only. Um, the Coffer-Harris Amendment was enacted in an attempt to ensure the safety and effectiveness of all new drugs on the market. So that you actually had to have repeated studies. It started the process of how things worked. It moved the burden of effectiveness of a medication from a complaint being lodged and a patient saying and things that didn't work. It made the company that was going to produce the medication, it basically made them prove their medicine worked. It changed the way certain trials were done. Um, it also started was one of the first acts that helped start to prevent the sale of certain medications to pregnant people due to the fact that it caused birth defects. So um, it started to make um, us look at how medications affected pregnant women as well. In 1970, the Comprehensive Drug Abuse and Prevention Act. This came about as part of Vietnam and some other things that went on around that time, but definitely made it was this particular act in 1970 created the Drug Enforcement Agency. So remember, the FDA regulates medications, drugs. It regulates them, but the Drug Enforcement Act or the agency or the DEA, they're the ones that go in and act like they're the kind of the police officers of pharmacy and of the pharmaceutical drug world. So where the FDA can approve or recall medications because they don't feel they're safe or because they feel like they are effective on a process, the DEA are the people who go in and enforce the laws that the FDA brings about. So the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act, it created the DEA. It also created scheduled drugs. So Schedule 1, Schedule 2, Schedule 3, Schedule 4, Schedule 5. This act was very important because it started to make the ability or the availability of certain medications a little harder to get to. So Schedule 1 medications were basically for research only, and Schedule 5 drugs basically had a very low to no risk for addiction. So that's what this was about. It was about abuse and addiction. Heroin started to come into the country during the 70s, and it became a big deal. And so we started to see the need for this act. The Orphan Drug Act, that allowed companies to bypass a lengthy time requirement for testing a new drug and the cost accompanied with them. Now, the thing behind this is the Orphan Drug Act of 83 was enacted for treatment for some cancers, for HIV, for things that were killing a lot of people. So if a disease affected 1 in every 200,000 people, they could speed along the process of getting that drug approved. Many times, even now, new drugs to be approved, it takes for development and then their initial application for a new drug and the different trial routes they have to go to. They have to go through multiple levels of trials from just research to animal testing and then human testing, and then it all has to go back for another application for approval before it's ever on the market. So it takes years, 10, sometimes 20 years before things are put on the market. The Orphan Drug Act made some vaccines and some other things have a quicker route to get to the patient. So if you think about it, if we were to find a drug that would prevent heart attacks, and we could give that to everyone, we would not want it to be a 30-year down the road, 20-year down the road, or even a 10-year down the road process before it could get on the market. We would want to do trials to make sure it was safe in animals and safe in humans, but and make sure that was repeated. But we might not want to wait 20 years before that drug got on the market. So that's what the Orphan Drug Act was enacted for. The Prescription Drug Marketing Act. So this came about in 87. It required labeling that the federal law restricted this drug to be used by or in an ordered by a veterinarian. So caution, federal drug restricts this drug to be used by or ordered by a licensed veterinarian. At one point, controlled drugs are still used for animals. They give them Xanax, they give them tramadol, they give them antibiotics, they give them tons of different medication. Well, the Prescription Drug Marketing Act made it clear that there had to be a separation in medications made for animals and medications made for human consumption. Even though many of them are made in the same facility, there are different processes in some of the medications that have to happen before different processing for humans and for dogs or for cows or for whatever animal. So the Prescription Drug Act, Marketing Act, started control the use of drugs in animals. Also, it made things like PCP, which is a horse tranquilizer that is abused. Different things like that. Like I said, tramadol, different pain medications, different anxiety medications that are given to animals. It made them it made a control or a way to control the distribution of those. In 1990, the Anabolic Steroid Act was enacted. We had a large number of athletes, high school, professional, college athletes in the late 80s that were late 80s, mid to late 80s that were using anabolic steroids for performance enhancement. This was the fines and the regulations and the ability to get these anabolic steroids. It changed. They went from a Schedule 4 drug to a Schedule 2 drug. So to get testosterone, you have to have a very specific documentation for a need, and you have to have the appropriate prescription. It has to be written on or sent on the controlled prescription pad. It has to have the specific amount, and that you can't refill that. There actually has to be new scripts sent in for that to be refilled. So it's one of those things. It's also a medication that when it's kept in the clinic, it has to be kept under double lock, just like a hydrocodone or any other Schedule 2 drug. It has to be counted every day. It has to be really monitored. In 1990, also, we had the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act, or the ORBA of 1990. It had to do with more specific practices within the pharmacy and about reimbursement related to Medicare and Medicaid, and how prescriptions were handled, and how if you got money from Medicare or Medicaid, you had to fill meds. You couldn't refuse care to them. State pharmacies also had to be canceled during this time related to the purchase of medications and for how patients received those new prescriptions. About education, Omnibus made it a requirement for if a patient got a new medication, they have to be counseled on it so that they could go in and make sure the patient understood what they were taking, what the side effects were, and also how um, what could happen if they didn't take their medicine. So that counseling session is important. Generally, it's done by the pharmacist, not necessarily by the pharmacy technician, although occasionally it might be on in some instances. It also said that patients must be given that monolith or the monograph. The monolith, this is that monograph, that paper that comes inside the prescription that lists those side effects and interactions. Also, we started to review patients' medications and do medication reconciliations on this, to not only to make sure that patients were not on the same medication for multiple doctors, but also to make sure that their medications weren't overlapping. That I wasn't taking a medicine for my blood pressure and then a medicine for another condition that would make them counteract or that would cause a more significant problem. So the Omnibus Reconciliation Act, it actually did a lot of things. Um, so it helped basically grow our ability to manage financially how medications were done, also for people to understand their medications, and for us to kind of help slow down polypharmacy anyway. And polypharmacy just means a patient taking more than 5 medications at one time. The HIPAA, we've already talked about HIPAA, so I'm going to really quickly go over that, but just for a second, because you guys should really understand HIPAA, that basically HIPAA was initially enacted to make it make it easier for physicians, pharmacists, physical therapists, for healthcare providers to share information, but also for those same providers not to be able to um, share information with people that did not need it. Also, it set up for when information was going to be exchanged, that there had to be consent by the patient to share that information, and how patients could request their information and actually get their health information. So a lot of things happened in HIPAA, the HIPAA Act in '96. With these particular laws, you will need to know the years. I didn't tell you that in the beginning, and I'm sorry, but you will need to know the years with these laws because they'll be specific on the test. The FDA versus the DEA. So they are very important with respect to pharmacy. The FDA, once again, it was created back in 1938, but it's also has some control. It was it was created under the umbrella of the the Department of Health and Human Services. The Department of Health and Human Services is a federal company. Now, most of you know that there's the Department of Health and Human Services in each state, and then there are little smaller offices in counties. Well, the FDA was built or created under the federal Health and Human Services Department of Health and Human Services. And its main function was to enforce guidelines for the manufacturing and safety of medications. So, like I said, the FDA, they have that ability to look at a drug or look at a medication, make sure it's being processed correctly. They look at to make sure that the effectiveness of the drug and the potency of the drug is what they say it's going to be, that it's not causing more damage, and that if a population of people take that particular medication, it's not going to actually make them worse rather than better. The DEA, now they are under the Department of Justice. So that's another thing you can remember. Like I said, the FDA creates and gives us the ability to have medication, and that's under Health and Human Services. And you would think about that. Medications are developed for health. Well, DEA is under the Department of Justice, and they are there to prevent the illegal or misuse of narcotics and other controlled substances. Also, all doctors, pharmacies, and people who manufacture controlled substances, anything that's a Schedule 2, 3, any controlled drug, they have to be licensed by the DEA. So when you get a prescription in to your pharmacy is going to have a DEA number because they're going to have controlled substances in their building. So they are monitored by the DEA, and they're licensed and they're inspected by the DEA. Then the people who prescribe those medications, they must have a DEA number as well. They must have been cleared by the Department of the Drug Enforcement Agency. They must have cleared them, and they must have a valid DEA number. So when you get a prescription in, one of the things you're going to be looking for is a DEA number. Now, also in the state of Texas, they must have a DPS number, a Department of Public Safety number. It is another fail-safe to help look at doctors who are prescribing controlled substances. So they'll have a DEA number and a DPS number in the state of Texas. Not every state requires a Department of Public Safety number. Every state requires a DEA number. So for testing purposes, a DEA number will be on all scripts. In the state of Texas, just to know in practice, they will need a DPS number as well. FDA reporting process and adverse reactions. So there is a toll-free number, 1-800-FDA-1088. And it's for reporting any defects found in over-the-counter medication or any other drug issues. If you have people coming in saying that they bought a few people come in and say they bought a bottle of Tylenol and the plastic outer seal is not on it, that needs to be reported. If you have a group of people that report a reaction to a medication, and they bought it from it came into the pharmacy in the same lot, like the same order, and you've sent out 20 prescriptions for penicillin, and 10 of them came back with weird symptoms, or they all have the same symptom, like a rash, or they have nosebleed or something that's not normal, then you would want to report that. If someone's hospitalized because of a medication, or they die because of a medication. And here's an example of something that I have seen happen in my years of working. So I know that a pharmacy in this area received a bulk supply of Lasix, which is a loop diuretic. The bottle that it came in said 20 milligram tabs, but the tab inside of the bottle that came from the manufacturer was actually an 80 milligram tablet. So someone who was supposed to get 20 milligrams was getting 80 milligrams. That definitely could cause a problem. That could cause death in some people. So that had to be reported to the FDA. Whoever reports that, your identity is kept confidential. Also, when you report that the patient's outcomes or the patient's issues, that's also kept confidential. The patient may be contacted and spoken to, but it will not be shared outside of the reporting process. MedWatch is a program under the FDA that allows consumers and health professionals to report any discrepancies in medications, adverse reactions. I know several years ago there was a lot of insulin that went out, of bovine insulin that went out, and it caused a really bad reaction in about 10,000 people. I found that out from a MedWatch alert. I get MedWatch alerts that come to my phone and my email, and have since for 20 years. And it's a good thing to get. As a medical professional, you can access that and you can report it, but you will also get information on drug recalls. So for about 4 years ago, there was a large lot of a Alzheimer's medication that was recalled, and they actually had the pharmacy, or the not the pharmacy, The pharmacy did have to send all their supplies back. We had to send all of our samples back into the FDA. But also, and I apologize, Zeus is eating his squeak toy because I'm recording at home, guys. But also, they had to stop making it. They had to shut down the facility where it was being made. They had to clean it. And then they had to start over the process, and the FDA had to come back out and reinspect before they could send any more out. So we actually went about 6 months without that Alzheimer's medicine, that a particular strength of an Alzheimer's medicine, and they had no choice. They had to choose the long acting, which was much more expensive. Anyway, those are things that happen, and I found that once again. We found that out from MedWatch and shipped our stuff back. So those kind of things really do happen, and you will get letters in the mail. You'll get contacted by drug companies when there's a recall, and your facility will have a procedure for contacting anyone who may have had that medication. Controlled substances, they are usually known as narcotics or addictive medications. They can be made of opium or things that make the brain think they're opium. Opium comes from a poppy seed plant, from a specific part of it. It was actually developed as an analgesic for pain, but it also alters the entire nervous system. You guys are very familiar with that. There have been news articles and media and information about narcotics for a long time and our narcotic problem in the world. So some of those are codeines, hydrocodone, morphine, some medications that tramadol is a medication that makes it think you took an opiate, although it doesn't. Anyway, they are all opiates, and all medications that can be addictive are given a certain schedule, and the schedule is based on or dependent on how addictive they are. So, you guys read some about this. Registration is required for maintaining narcotics. The DEA has three kinds of forms. The 224 is needed for a pharmacy to dispense controlled substances. So, you have to have a Form 1024 in place to dispense a controlled substance. 225 is to manufacture a controlled substance. So, people that manufacture controlled substances, so the 224 goes to a pharmacy. The 225 goes to the drug company. And the 363 is to run narcotic treatment programs or compound narcotics. Those are generally done in universities, have those, or people who do studies, people who do pain control clinics, and they may put in pain pumps, which will release a certain amount of a narcotic every hour continually. So those are the different kinds of forms, and you will need to know those that are out there that are being utilized. Oops, wrong way, guys. Oh, okay. So the pharmacy, for the pharmacy to obtain a Schedule II drug, so that would be like hydrocodone, fentanyl patches, things like that that are distributed. You have to fill out a Form 222, and for the pharmacy to receive that, it has to be. Most of these are done digitally now, but before it was done by a pen or a typewriter. Now we do it specifically digitally. We print them out digitally. They are no longer some pharmacies still use them as a carbon. Pretty much now you print one copy for the supplier, one copy for the DEA, and then one copy stays at the pharmacy. And that's how kind of that goes. But copies are kept in each location. Also, you may not have errors. Also, you cannot throw them away. So if you have a Form 222 and it has to be voided, you have to write void on it, and you put it in a file, and it stays there. It stays there. Like if you've printed it off and you realize, oh my gosh, this is wrong, you literally have to take that form, write void on it, and you have to keep that in a file until the DEA says you can get rid of it. So ordering controlled substances that are a 3, 4, or a 5, though that is just a normal invoice. A normal order form that goes to the and non-scheduled drugs. It's your normal order form to the manufacturer. You do have to keep those forms for 2 years for schedules 3, 4, and 5. Schedule 3, 4s, and 5s are just lesser, like Valium, Xanax, Ativan. Those are some different controls that you would have to keep those forms for a couple years. Receipt from a controlled substance pharmacist. They keep the invoice with the order form. So when you fill out the 222, you also keep the invoice for when the medication comes in and they're signed for, and you keep those copies together. You keep your invoice, you keep your order form, the pharmacy's copy of the order form, and they have to stay together for 7 years. You cannot destroy them. They cannot be removed from the pharmacy for 7 years. So there are three methods of filling out controlled substances and controlled substance legends. You have to have. So what happens is most of these are done through a Pyxis now. Schedule 2 drugs are in one place. Schedule 3 drugs are in another place. Schedule 4 drugs and Schedule 5 drugs are in another place. You keep Schedule 2 drug ledgers, which is like the documentation on when you received it, how many you received, how many you had in stock before you received a shipment, how many you dispense out to, and who you dispense them out to, and what time you dispense them out. All of that, you have software that tracks that now. Used to, it had to be done by hand. Some places they still are done by hand, but pretty much it's tracked through a system within your software. And we're going to look at some of that. I'm working on ordering some of that licensed software. But remember that you have to have a beginning of the day count and an end of the day count. And there has to be more than one person count these drugs. They have to be double counted and double signed off for. You can't just, especially in Texas, you have to keep accurate records, and you have to keep them for 10 years in some states. So ratings for controlled substances, the letter C means controlled. Also, there will be a Roman numeral after it. 1 I, 2 I's, 3 I's, IV, or a V. Those are the 5 levels of potency based on potential abuse, and they're set up that way. So a control 1 those are the ones that have the strongest potential for abuse and should not be in medical use. That means they shouldn't be in the pharmacy. Things like LSD, heroin, marijuana. Those are medications that should not be in the pharmacy to be sold. They are there's too much of a risk. Schedule 2, 3, and 4 drugs generally are all narcotics. Schedule 5 drugs are usually the over-the-counter drugs. Those are things like Sudafed. Sudafed is a Schedule 5 drug that's kept behind the counter. Schedule 2 drugs have to be locked up. You have them in the pharmacy, that they are sold, but they do have to be under usually a double locking system. How that happens in some pharmacies is they have a Pyxis or I forgot what the other system is called. Sorry, I can't remember. But basically, what happens is you have a thumbprint. You'll have your thumbprint that it'll read some kind of bio read, and then you'll also have a password that goes in along with the thumbprint. So it's a big locking system that has them in it, and then you're going to choose what medication you want. So say you're choosing hydrocodone, a drawer with hydrocodone will pop out, and then you may have to put in another password, or there could potentially be a key that goes along it where you have to open another drawer to get that out. Those are things that are very common on how those medications are kept. There are very strict guidelines. Schedule 2 drugs in the state of Texas, the one drug, okay, let me back up. Schedule in other states, not in Texas, but in other states, remember that hydrocodone is a Schedule 3 drug. In the state of Texas, it's a Schedule 2 drug. But in other states, hydrocodone is a Schedule 3 drug. So on your test, they may ask you what that is, and it is a Schedule 3 drug outside of Texas. Things about that you should know: Schedule 2 through 4 drugs. Schedule 2 drugs may no longer be filled for 5 times in 6 months. Schedule 3 and 4 drugs can be scheduled for 5 refills in 6 months. Schedule 2 drugs may only be filled for 3 months in the state of Texas. They only may be filled for 30 days. You must wait 30 days to fill that Schedule 2 drug. So if you filled it on the 24th and there's 31 days in the month, you can fill it on the 23rd of the next month. That is Schedule 2 drugs in the state of Texas. Schedule 3 and 4 drugs, they can write, like Xanax is a Schedule 4 drug. It can be filled. Sorry, guys. It can be filled with refills. Schedule 2 drugs may not be filled with a refill. You have to keep records. They have to be double counted. The pharmacist has to have initials on it. Usually they put them in a red or a different color ink than the actual prescription bottle. So there's lots of things that go along with prescription drug refills. Monographs. So those are the package inserts. Those are the things that look like what the physician drug reference says on the inside. It tells you about what you need to know about monographs. It describes the chemical makeup. It describes all of the positive and negative things about the drug. It describes what the drug is supposed to do, how long it acts, what it interacts with, what it won't act with, and then how any kind of warning or precaution. Also tells you things like take it on an empty stomach, take it on a full stomach, take it with a whole glass of water. Don't go out in the sun if you take this medicine. This medication must be protected from light. All those kind of things are on the monographs, which are on the inside of the package. Also, we print a specific monograph out for the patient with some of that information, like why they're taking it, what it's supposed to help, what are adverse reactions, what are signs and symptoms of allergic reaction, and if it can cause drug abuse or dependence. Prescription regulations. So who can prescribe? The DEA and FDA have no authority in determining prescribers. They can regulate it, but they can't determine it. Prescribers are licensed by their governing bodies. So like in the state of Texas, nurse practitioners and PAs cannot prescribe Schedule 2 drugs. Other states, they can. Schedule 2 drugs are not just hydrocodone and fentanyl patches. It's also a lot of ADHD medicine, things like that. So different states have different laws related to who can prescribe what controlled substance. But standard practitioners in all 50 states, doctors, MDs, DOs, surgeons, dentists, podiatrists, veterinarians, and optometrists, doctors can usually prescribe medications. PAs and nurse practitioners, they have more limits. Pharmacy technicians can take a prescription, they can interpret them, and they can fill them, but they cannot take phone orders. Now, here's where the stickler is. A lot of doctors will fax prescriptions in or leave prescriptions on a phone, voicemail. Those are a little tricky. The pharmacist really should write those down. And I know, and to be honest, the pharmacy technicians in this area are very good about when I, as a nurse, have called in a prescription for a doctor, because that is within my scope of practice. They would say, "Hold on, let me give you the pharmacist." And so then I would give the order to the pharmacist. Pharmacy technicians cannot do that. Also, pharmacists must do the final check before the medication goes out to the patient, and they also must verify all scripts filled by a technician to make sure they're accurate. And they are the only people who can transfer prescriptions. So if I wanted to transfer my prescription from Cody Drug to Walmart, I would have to talk to the pharmacist about that. I could not tell that to a technician. So if a patient calls in and wants to transfer their prescriptions, You can't do that as a technician. You have to give the phone to the pharmacist and let the pharmacist take that information. Receiving prescriptions for controlled substances. Pharmacists can receive oral prescriptions for controlled substances over the phone, but we generally don't. We take as few verbal orders, so phone orders. We take as few of those as possible. A pharmacist can do that, but you can't. Anytime they're calling in a prescription, once again, remember, you can't take a phone order, the doctor can. We want as many paper or faxed or electronics, preferably electronic orders that we can get. Every state has a little bit different regulation on Schedule II drugs, but we're going to look at Texas. I'm going to give you something specific about Texas's Schedule II drugs. So just remember that Schedule II drugs are very strict on how things happen. In the state of Texas, they've got to have an ink writing. They have to be on a specific pad, or they have to come through in a specific link from your pharmacy directly to that doctor. Prescription labeling. All right, we are going to stop here and we will pick up on labels a little next time. All right, you guys have a great day.